Hey, welcome to the Mobile Minute from Dropsource. I'm Will, this is Nate. Today we want to do a bit of an extended edition of the Dropsource Mobile Minute so that we can take a deep dive into one of the more challenging areas of app development we've encountered while building apps in Flutter. So we built a lot of apps using the Flutter framework and we're big fans, but one of the areas that we found challenging, and we've heard from other users that they found challenging, is setting up multiple environments. As an example, you're setting up your development version, your QA version, your production version for iOS and Android. There's a lot of coordination required with that many different development environments. Nate, can you talk with us for a minute about what makes it specifically challenging to set up multiple environments when building apps in Flutter?
Yeah, I think the big challenge with configuring multiple environments is the difference in how iOS handles it and the difference in how Android handles it. iOS uses something called schemes and build configurations, where Android uses their native technology called flavors. And so how you coordinate your Flutter code to run with Android flavors and how you coordinate your Flutter code to run with Xcode schemes is different and can be very cumbersome. And so for us, setting that up for the first couple apps we built has been a huge challenge. And so the hope for this video is that we can save you some of that pain. As a bonus, at the end of this project, you'll get a link to the GitHub repository of where we're actually storing the code for this starter project. So ideally, you'll be able to use this project into the future for all your Flutter projects and have this as a repeatable way for setting up a Flutter project to deploy to your QA environment, your development environment, and your production environment.
Great. Let's jump in.
Let's do it. Hey, everybody. Today we're here to talk a little bit about how to build and deploy a Flutter application to multiple environments. And so really the most prominent use case for this is on most mobile teams, you have some developers working in a development environment, and so that's using development data, maybe a development API, development versions of your services like analytics and crash reporting. You also typically will have QA testers working on a stable version of your application that's in some staging environment where it's using staging data, etc. And then same thing for production where your actual users are using your application. Okay, and so as an app developer using Flutter, you need a way to configure your app to be able to run and have different configurations for each of these environments. Okay, and so for this demo, we're going to be talking about how to specifically set up a development environment, a staging environment, and a production environment. So that right from your IDE, you'll be able to say run in development, and it'll load in all the right environment variables, etc., and run that for each of your different environments. So at this point, you're probably familiar with how to use the basic CLI for Flutter and do Flutter run, which points directly to your main.dart file. When you're working with multiple environments, the first step is to set up multiple entry points. Okay, and so each of these different environments has its own main.dart file in essence. Okay, and so let's look into the actual folder structure here. We have the lib folder, which is where all of your Dart code is. I've created an app folder, which is where I typically will hold all of the different environment-specific code, and then also the main app widget. So that's either your material app or your Cupertino app. And so before I jump into some of the code, Android and Flutter have a concept called flavors, which is really just they call it different flavors of your app, which really translates to different environments or different build configurations. There's 100 terms for it. And so I apologize if that gets a little bit confusing throughout this, but this folder will hold all of the different flavors of our application. So our development environment, our production environment, our staging environment, and our testing environment. So to start, let's look at our main.development or our main development Dart file. So here you'll see that this has a main function that whenever we run this file, we're actually going to be running a specific Flutter app config. Okay, and so I'll dig into this file a little bit in a minute, but basically this specifies the environment we're running, the base URL of our API, and the app name, and for this app use case, whether or not to initialize Crashlytics. Okay, so these different files here, you can really set up your app config file to have all of the different environment dependent values. So let's click into this file quickly. So for our app, depending on the environment, I want to change the app name, give it a specific environment, maybe the base URL, whether I want to monitor connectivity or not. And so you can see how these are all of the values that I want to change depending on the environment. Sometimes when I'm running my unit tests or my integration tests, I don't want to monitor for connectivity, or I don't want to initialize Crashlytics. So this allows me to be very fine-grained about what I turn on and don't turn off, or what I turn on and turn off within the different environments. You can look in here. This is really a wrapper for the main run function of your app. So typically apps will have some type of state. So I have a loading state function here usually. I have a function to create the app. So I have a Flutter app that I've built, and then I have this run function that will put it all together and actually run the app using Flutter's run app function. So I won't get into all the details of how to set up your Flutter app. We can save this for a different time. But essentially, the first step on the Flutter side is to set up all of the different files for your different environments. So I'm going to create a main development, a main production, a main staging, and a main testing. We'll look quickly at the actual app file. This is just the material app that we're using whenever the app runs. You can see here we typically use this very basic setup for all of our apps. Again, not super important for the demo, but I'll show you it anyways. Okay, so this is the first step for configuring the Flutter side. So now that we have the different files set up for the different entry points of our app, we now need a way for these entry points to map to the native iOS host that's in Xcode and the native Android host that's in, call it Android Studio, okay? So let's flip over first to the iOS side, okay? We talked a little bit about flavors. So we have 3 different flavors. We have a development flavor, we have a staging flavor, we have a production flavor, and we have a testing flavor. Okay, so all of these are the different flavors that we're going to be matching up to the iOS side. And so taking a quick step back, iOS does not use the same terminology and therefore, setup that Android and Flutter does. It doesn't actually have flavors, but it has a very similar concept called schemes. Okay, they really are the same thing. You're meant to create a different scheme to represent some configuration of your app. Okay, and so the first step here is inside of your Xcode, you're going to want to click on the little blue icon here, and then go to Product, and go to Scheme, and go to Manage Schemes. Okay, so what you'll see here is all of the different schemes for your app. And typically for a new project, it'll only have the runner app. You'll see I've gone ahead and created development, production, staging, testing. So for your different schemes that you want to create, hit a plus button here, and you're going to change the target to be runner, and say you want to have a QA environment. Okay, so you're going to hit OK, and that's going to add a QA scheme to your project. And then you always want to make sure that these are shared. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that because that was just to show you how to actually create it. So now that we have our 4 schemes created for our project, we want to now set up the different build configurations that we can run against these schemes. So I understand this might be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with Xcode, but bear with me. I think it'll all make sense in the end. So click on this blue icon again, and then go over to this runner dropdown, and you're going to want to change the target. Oh, no, sorry. You want to go back to the project. So here you'll see the different configurations. These configurations are really meant to map to these main.dart files. Okay, so I have debug testing, I have a debug production, I have a debug staging, release production, release staging, release development. And so you'll see here that these don't just have the schemes being production, staging, development, but they also have the mode. Okay, so the mode is what we're going to now call debug and release. Okay, so whenever you're deploying an app to a device or to the App Store, you're typically running that code in release mode. And when you're testing and debugging it, you're usually running in debug mode. Okay, so to add another layer onto this, you can run your app against any scheme with any mode. Okay, so say I want to publish to the App Store, I would do that with the release production. If I want to publish it to my QA internal testing, maybe using test flight, I would use release staging and so forth. So this sets up kind of the scaffolding for the iOS side. Next, we need to go into actually setting the different configuration values that will change based on where the app is running. Okay, so we're going to switch this over to the runner target. And you'll see here there are a couple things that we need to think about. Okay, if you're familiar with iOS, you know that similar to the Android side, where Android uses application IDs, it's usually the reverse domain syntax like com.dropsource.appname. iOS has a similar thing, but it's called bundle identifier. Okay, and so we want to set up the bundle identifier to be different for each flavor. Okay, so that way I can have multiple apps running on my device that all have a different bundle ID. So I can test my development version, I can test my staging version, I can test my production version all on my device without having to overwrite the app each time. And so to do that, I'm going to click over into the info.plist file, and I'm going to change the bundle identifier value to this, $ parentheses product bundle identifier. Okay, and this is meant to really represent a variable that's going to point to our build configuration file. Okay, and we'll get to this in a minute, where we'll actually be changing this value based on the environment. And we're going to do the same thing for the bundle display name. Okay, the bundle display name is what actually shows up on the app icon. And so change this to app display name. All right, and so now if you click on the runner tab again, and this time we go over to build settings, you'll see lots of different values here, and it can get a little confusing, but we're going to go directly to the search bar, and we're going to find our bundle identifier. Okay, so this pulls up our bundle identifier variable. Okay, so you'll see that this directly references that info.plist file. And now, based on the environment that we're running in, I can change the bundle identifier. So if I'm running in debug development, I'm going to use the bundle identifier com.dropsource.flutter_flavors. It's a mouthful, flutterflavors.development. Same thing for production. This is my App Store version, so I'm not going to append a suffix, but staging and testing, these will all get their own bundle identifier. So that, again, for the sake of being able to run these in parallel next to each other on the same device. Okay, so that's for your bundle identifier. We now have that set up. So whenever we run in debug testing mode or debug staging, it's going to pull in and use this configuration value. Okay, so now we also want to change the display name. Oops. You'll see here, again, we can change all the different values based on the different environments. Okay, I won't go through this again, but very similar process. The next thing is a very important step. This actually got me tripped up for a long time and caused me a lot of headache, but I think I finally got it, and this should help you. So there's another value that Flutter uses called the Flutter target. Okay, and so on the iOS side, this is extremely redundant, but you need to make sure that this matches up directly with your Dart side. Okay, so whenever I run in development mode, this is, again, kind of redundantly saying use the main development Dart file. When I'm running in production, use the main production file. And so this is really important to do, or else you'll get errors where there'll be a mismatch between what you're specifying in your command line arguments, where you say, -t app flavors main production.dart. It'll not match with the iOS side, and you'll get errors. Okay, So once this matches, you should be good on the iOS side. For simplicity's sake, I have changed my signing to just do automatic, to automatically manage the signing. But if you want to get more granular, which we often do, you can uncheck this, and then you'll see here, you get the different build configurations again. Okay, so you can more manually manage, what provisioning profiles you're going to use for iOS for debug versus production versus testing versus staging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I'm working on a project, a lot of times I will do this because it gives me a lot more control, but for the sake of this demo, I think that's a little bit too much to show. All right, moving on to the Android side. So at this point, just to recap, whenever you run in the staging environment, this will now sync your Flutter code to your iOS code and use all of the different values accordingly. So the next step is to set up the Android side. Android is actually a lot easier to set up in this regard. So the first thing we're going to do is, I'm not going to open Android Studio or else my computer might explode, but if you click on the Android folder in your Flutter project, go to App, and you go to, let me close these, sorry, and you go to your build.gradle file. You'll see here, this is very familiar to most build.gradle files for Flutter, but we are going to add a few specific entries here, okay? The ones that we're going to focus on are the build types and the product flavors, all right? So build types, if you remember back to iOS, we called these modes, where you can run in release mode or debug mode, okay? So we're establishing that these both exist in Android. Okay, so these are just details about how we want to sign it, some of the ProGuard rules. We won't get into all these. But next is the product flavors. You remember back to iOS where we created the individual schemes. All you have to do for Android is just add these 3 entries here. Okay, we're specifying that this is in the flavors dimension, which basically gets specified here. And so we're creating a development, a staging, and a production. And so this allows us to, by default, add a application ID suffix. So this will append .development to any app ID when it's running in development, or when it's running the development flavor. Same thing for staging, and for production, we actually don't want to because this will be deployed to the App Store or the Google Play Store. And so once you do this, you have a few other things that you can do to work with flavors. One of them is inside of your app source file. There's a lot of times there's things like app icons. I've seen in other tutorials where some people want to actually change the app icon depending on if it's development, staging, production. I personally don't like to do that because when I'm working with clients, they don't want to see a different version of their app. We typically rely on just the name to differentiate, which I think is enough. But if you're working with something like Firebase, or if you're working with different images that you want to change depending on the application, you can create a folder inside of this source file. So one for development, one for production, one for staging. I actually did this for Firebase. You can drop your different files in there, and then depending on the environment it uses, it'll actually pull that value, which is really handy. And so not necessary, you don't have to do that in your application, but if you want to have different files or assets depending on the different environment, then you can do that. All right, that should wrap up the Android setup for you. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to actually now run the application in different environments. And so I've showed you here, I personally like Visual Studio Code. I think it's the best IDE for Flutter development. So I typically will run all of my apps through here, but I understand that a lot of people will just use the command line. So if you're using Android or Visual Studio Code, you can actually get a hold of this, which will allow you to just point your staging environment to your main staging file, passing the flavor, vice versa for prod, dev, testing. But if you're using the command line, you're going to want to use this command. So you'll see here, I can run Flutter run -t actually specifies the entry point. So lib app flavors main staging. We're also going to specify the flavor that we're running, which is staging, and we're going to specify debug mode. Okay, so we can also change that to release mode. And then now you can start to see how your app will run with all the staging configuration values in release mode and vice versa. All right, so for this, again, my app is super simple. It really just has a button on it. But you'll see when I hit run here, this is actually now running the main staging in debug mode. And so this will, the app at some point will pop up and we'll actually see the app running. And so for me personally, this was a pretty big headache to figure out how to do. Caused a lot of issues when we were first getting started with Flutter. And so I thought it'd be useful to make this video, and I hope that this process is a little bit less daunting now and makes a little bit more sense.
Thank you, Nate, and we hope that was useful. There's a link in the description to this video to our GitHub repository, which has the example project which we demoed today for you to explore and fork. Here on our channel and in these Mobile Minute videos, we're going to be sharing tips, tricks, and best practices for working with Flutter. If you're interested in the content, please do like and subscribe. Also, we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about this video, or would like to see other videos from us having to do with Flutter, please do leave a message in the comments and we'll get back to you. Thanks again for joining us for the Mobile Minute, and we'll see you next time.